Why, hello there. Welcome to the video. We are going to look at the decisive game in the match between Magnus Carlsen and Jan-Krzysztof Duda from Poland. The other spot in the finals was already captured by Sergey Karjakin after defeating Vladimir Fedoshev. I haven't really had time to cover the semifinals so far, and to be honest, the first few games weren't that interesting. A lot of draws and uneventful games, but today, of course, the rapid tiebreak. First game was drawn, and now Magnus Carlsen has the white pieces. And if he can win, he advances. Draw, we have another pair of 10-minute games. And if Duda wins, then he advances. So we have the Sicilian. Magnus opens with e4 and we have c5. Now, Jan-Krzysztof Duda, he ended Magnus Carlsen's undefeated streak. Magnus set a world record for the longest streak without losing a game at the highest level. I can't remember the number, it was somewhere around 120. But Duda, he broke that streak. So maybe there's some psychology behind that. I don't know, but let's see. Knight to f3, d6, indicating he wants to play the Najdorf. But Magnus wants a quiet game, so he plays bishop b5. And we have a trade, bishop d7. So black plays bishop d7 here in the Moscow and takes with the queen. Now white has some options here. He can castle, or he can play for c4. If you play for c4, you need to know what to do against queen g4, for instance. But Magnus keeps it safe. He castles. And knight f6 by Duda. We protect the pawn. And knight c6. Now I believe the general idea is that if black goes here, we want to go c3, d4. And if he goes e6, we'd like to play with c4 and d4, some kind of a Maroczy bind structure. But here white already takes a decision, plays c3. And so black switches it around and plays e6. Nonetheless, white gets the center here, plays d4, takes. And white has kind of achieved what we try to do in most openings, to get this pawn duo here in the center. And we cannot really leave the pawn duo as it is, and as in most openings, when you give up the center at some stage, you have to strike in it, and that's what Duda does. He plays d5. Now if we take on d5, we're just left with an isolated pawn. We traded off the light square bishop. That's not very promising, so we keep our space advantage e5. Duda jumps into e4, knight into e4, and knight b to d2. So compared to the French defense, and this is basically a French defense structure we have here, with white's pawns here and here. And this can arise in many openings. We see this now from the Sicilian, we can see it from the Caro-Kann, we can see it from the Slav defense. So this is an important structure to know, the plans for both sides, because you can easily end up in it in many openings, like I said. So Duda played bishop b4 here, and I think he wants a trade. Magnus played bishop f4. If we trade, I think too many pieces are coming off the board, and black's plan is easy. Maybe h6 at some stage, castle, and then just go to the c file. And in my experience, d4 is the only kind of weak spot on the board. So Magnus avoids the trade, plays bishop to f4, and black castles. Let's see. Yeah, black bishop f4 and black castles. Now, queen to d3. And, well, Duda probably didn't want to allow knight to g5. Could have maybe gone h6. Don't think there are tactical problems yet, but bishop back to e7. And now he will chop off if knight g5. a3 by Magnus anyway, taking away the b4 square. Rook a to c8. Black usually tries to find play on the c file in such a structure. Now a move by Magnus I didn't really quite fully understand, g3. It seems more natural at some stage to move the h pawn. That would also make Luft on this square. So I don't understand what we're doing with g3, to be honest. Maybe he wanted the bishop protected in case black were to break with f6. Must be something like that. Okay, so knight a5, another standard move. We open the c file and we also target the c4 square. But b3 by white takes away the square and for the moment makes the knight not the greatest piece, but it has a function at the moment. It is attacking the pawn on b3. So if black can add an attacker to the pawn, white has to do something. And that's what Duda does, queen c6. That's the bishop d2. He maneuvered the queen to b6, and now we have double attack here on b3. And we cannot play b4. That weakens the light squares too much, and the knight would jump into c4, and we would start to regret life. Black would take over here. So to queen b6, we have rook at the b1. The only way to protect the pawn, because the other rook was defending this one. We have a6, king g2. Probably not the idea of g3, but white slightly improves the king. It's now on a different color than the bishop. Doesn't matter right now, but could be an issue later. Also, we protect the knight, so multi-purpose move. Knight c6, with the pawn being protected. Black thinks now that an attack on d4 is more important, and also he has another idea in mind, which we will see. Rook e1 was played, no longer needed here. Maybe he wants to be flexible and have the rook here, and we'll see that in the line here after queen b5. Now, swapping queens is probably not good. We're going to take with the a pawn and put pressure on the a file. That looks like a very good position for black. So queen b1. And now if black were to go back to a5, I think Magnus's idea must have been to protect here from e3. And the rook is flexible, and once we start, trying to attack on the king side, then the rook could maybe swing over in some key lines. But black wanted to improve the position, so he played rook to c7. Looks like a logical plan to put pieces on the c file. h4, rook f to c8, and rook a2. Not trying to stay flexible, also covering this square, because once the knight moves, there could be penetration with the rook, so rook a2, and now a5. Knight a5 was also a strong candidate move, targeting b3, and now we can't play rook e3 actually, because knight c4, so probably we would have to chop off on a5 here. So knight a5 definitely was a choice, but after rook a2, a5 was played. So Duda wants to play a4 and soften up the light squares. And he manages to do so with a4. It's tempting here maybe to play knight g5 for white, but I think... No, not yet, because here we would simply just... No, if you take, he's going to take with the h pawn. Okay. And g6 maybe. You had to look at some lines. I think this is working. Maybe we can take and play g6. But I think black should be fine here. He has a lot of pressure on these pawns, b3 and d4. White would need to compromise. But okay, this would have been complicated. But after a4, Magnus kept it simple and he played b4. But remember, now we have some weaknesses to worry about. The light squares are very tender, and having lost the light square bishops when we traded them off, white is suffering a bit on the light squares. So h6 now by Duda. He's not going to allow knight g5 now. Bishop to e3 and knight a7. Now black has taken over. This is a dream position for anybody that plays the French, who plays the Karjakin. I mean, white really hasn't gotten going with any attack on the king side. We're very solid on the king side. We can fortify the king side if we need to. We have the c file. There are weak light squares. The queen can penetrate if some squares open up here or here later. And the knight can jump into b5 from where it attacks a3, d4, and ice c3. So bishop d2, queen e2. So this is, from here it looks like close to a model game by Duda. Queen e2, rook e1. This looks tempting at first, attack on the queen, but then rook c2. This is very strong. And we're threatening the piece and f2, so we'd have to play this. Not that we can't take because of this, but a move such as knight b5 is very strong here. And even though white is up a pawn and there's no immediate threat, computer is assessing this as something like -4 for black. And the more you look at it, you realize that black is going to win this pawn, and once that drops, he's going to win this pawn, and everything simply falls apart for white. So a neat trap there by Duda, but Magnus didn't fall for it, and he played rook e1 instead. Queen back to c4, rook e3, and now the knight comes into b5. Rook d3, and here Duda kept playing well. I mean, it reminds me of many Karpov games. You know, most of his pieces are kind of ideally placed. The knight is very strong, putting pressure on some squares, and also eyeing c3 importantly. You know, so white can't interpose anything there. We triple on the c file, but what about the bishop? Can we improve the bishop? Yes, we can, and that's what Duda did. Duda did? What did Duda do? Duda did do it? Very good, Duda. So he played rook c6. What's the idea? What did Duda do? He's going to improve this bishop. He's going to play bishop d8 and bishop here. And that puts pressure on d4, so we improve the bishop. Rook b2, bishop d8. And g4, bishop b6. Now there's pressure here, so we have to defend. Bishop e3. But that takes away a defender of the c3 square, so now we can jump in, knight c3. Queen f1 and queen b5. So now the queen gets out of the way. We kind of want the queen at the back, kind of like the Alicant's gun, so the queen at least gets out of the way. Rook c2 and knight e4. Now the knight is deeper into the enemy camp. Takes. Rook d1. Magnus wants to trade, but Duda does not. He still has the advantage. He has the c file, no weaknesses, a better knight, better bishop, basically better prospects. So he keeps the queens. This trade, however, we can't avoid, so a logical decision by white, and now queen c6. Controlling the c file. Queen e2, rook c3, and rook a2. So here Duda played bishop to d8. The idea is to kind of force white to make a decision with these pawns, to push h5 or to play g5 as Magnus did. Now we have takes. Generally this would be a worry with the h file, but white is so far away from doing anything that we don't worry about it. And it's more important that in the end game the black king is able to penetrate and probably wreak havoc, you know, through these squares. So therefore, Duda is happy to try to enter an endgame here with queen to d3. Sorry, queen to c4. This we kind of have to take. Otherwise the queen might come around and even the white king becomes weak, so Magnus took on c4. And now d takes c4. And this is a very promising ending for black. Now he has a pass pawn, he can protect it if he wants. He can bring the king to attack this pawn, he can bring it to this square, or he could even bring it all the way the other way around and bring it here, an excellent square. Meanwhile, white is rather prospectless. The rook is passive, defending the pawn. He has kind of the anti-Capablanca rule with all of the pawns on the same color as his bishop. Meanwhile, black, fantastic. All the pawns basically more or less on light squares, so he's playing a light square strategy to complement his bishop. So the bishop can attack white's pawns, but the opposite simply isn't true. So Magnus realizes, okay, he's been kind of outplayed, well not kind of, he's been completely outplayed, and he needs to find some counterplay. And he plays a d5 here. And the idea is to simply try to activate this rook d2. So that's what he does, rook to d2. And he wants to take here. Now, if Duda had found rook to a3, this would have been a tremendous game. If we take this one, now we play rook d3. And the two passed pawns are simply too strong. White really can't take, and if something like rook c5, c3, and then the a pawn is coming as well, the weaknesses remain. You know, the king can always penetrate, and black is pawn up. So, kind of puzzled that Duda didn't go for that. Instead, he played rook d3 immediately, and now Magnus kind of gets a lifeline. He plays f4. Still, the weaknesses remain on the light squares, and this could be white's undoing. The king comes to f8, king f3, king e7. We have this check, king e6, king e3, and here Magnus shows that he's back in the game because he can take the pawn on d3. Now we have equal pawns. Theoretically, black is still better because of the weaknesses of on the light squares. But the problem here for black is that he can't take the pawn on f4, because then at g6 you can't allow me to take, so we take this, and now this one. And we're going to win stuff here, and the ending should be winning, because we can start the race, raise our king, get the b pawn, try to queen our b pawn, and in the meantime our bishop will be able to blockade the g1 square. So it takes time for black. He'd need to move the king, then we'd sacrifice the bishop, and we're going to win that race. So after king takes d3, no time to take on f4. So Duda needed to readjust here. He played g6, bishop e3, bishop c7. And here, having worked his way back into the game and probably thinking he can't lose this, looks like Magnus was flirting with the idea that he could win, and he played a b5 here. The problem with b5 is that this becomes another weakness. Magnus could have held the position relatively easily by just staying, doing nothing, playing bishop to c5. But the pawn is hanging, you might ask me. Yes, it is. But we have another trick, bishop to d6. Now if you trade, my pawn is going to queen. If you don't trade, you have to keep your bishop. e6. Yes, it's check, very similar to the trick that Fedoshev did against Tabarabai. Then we take this and we queen, and we win. So bishop c5 would have defended there. Instead, Magnus played b5. And maybe his idea was, maybe he saw this. Well, not maybe he saw this, king d3. Now if we take, all of a sudden it's black who needs to be careful. I think black can easily draw here by, I think he can play b6. And if king here, king here. Don't see a way for white to improve really. So white would probably need to go back, and then we'd simply have a repetition. Unless white could go for this pawn. Hang on a minute. Okay, at least black is not winning. And the other line would be to play king g4, which looks far more promising, keeping an eye on this. But then white will play b6, and it turns out black is in trouble. If he goes back, we go here, king here, king here. Zugzwang, we win this one. And if you go here, saying that, okay, if you go here, I take this, then pawn breakthroughs. f5 wins for white. e6 is coming, and if you take, I'll play either e6 or g6. Shouldn't really matter. Although, let's see, f4, king, f3, g7, f2 queens. We win. We could also play, no, we don't have to. f4, just king somewhere, king d2, f3, g7, f2 here. And we should win. So black needs to be careful. He can't take on e3. So maybe this is what Magnus was flirting with. King d3, but again, Duda was having none of it. He wanted to keep the bishop. Bishop back to d8, king d4, and he didn't repeat. He played bishop e7, hitting the pawn on a3. Magnus defends. King e6. And now we're trying to come around through the a5 square. King c5, and bishop to a5. Bishop c1, bishop c3. Very complicated endgame actually. Magnus played b6. What about bishop to e3? Just stopping d4. Idea being that if we go here, we go king b6 and we have a race, which might be interesting. But here, black actually wins because he can play b6. King can't go back, we're covering everything, has to take d4. And the problem is that, okay, we have a race, but black is going to win this race. and not just slightly, but with ease. We're covering the queen square. So b6 would have been a tremendous move there. So no bishop e3 there. Instead, Magnus played b6, avoiding this trick, but now the d pawn runs. King c4, king d7. Bishop e3, a clever move, because takes, we're going to pick up the pawn, and then we have some trumps on the king side. So bishop e2, and now Duda, he trades one advantage for the other. Bishop takes d4, bishop takes a3, so he gives away the d pawn, but now he has a very strong a pawn. And notice that white needs to spend the move here on bishop e3, because otherwise bishop here takes. So again, the Capablanca rule every time, too many pawns on the same color of the bishop, you have to attend to them. So bishop e3, a vital tempo to play bishop e2 and push the pawn. King b2, a3, king b3, stopping the pawn. But look at this, king a2, king d5, king e4, we need to keep control over f4, so bishop d2, and now another trade, we trade the a pawn for the b pawn. So now we get another pass pawn, and more importantly, we're just winning everything. Black to move and win. Find the winning move. If you set bishop to e3, you lost. If you set bishop to f2, you won. Bishop e3 loses, because now the white pawns are running. We're going to play e6, if you take g6, and we're going to queen. And in fact, if you take this, we're going to queen with jack. So the winning move is bishop f2. We're coming around and we're taking everything. Easy win. And Magnus is out of the World Cup. Extraordinary. I thought he was going all the way, and I'm sure he was pretty upset. This is a title he really wanted. He has never won the World Cup. But Jan-Krzysztof Duda, he moves into the candidates. I think he's a young and exciting participant in the candidates. I hope he does well. And of course, Sergey Karjakin returns to the candidates. So congratulations to those two. I'm sure we'll keep an eye on the final in the coming days. But for now, thanks for watching and see you next time. Bye bye.